His greatest story. This story begins in a magical land called Match. It is a small land with only one town, and that town is called Matchstick. The town is shaped like a matchstick, long, narrow, and straight. It isn't a large town, and there aren't many people who live there. But nearly everyone in Match has a name using the letters from the word matchstick. It is a pleasant town nestled in the mountains. Since it is in the mountains, it is cold most of the year. It is not uncommon to see fires burning in every house from fall to spring. In one house, however, there is always a fire burning, even in the summer. This house, in the center of the town, belongs to a shepherd named Mick. Mick is a tall man with big, friendly blue eyes and a long black beard. Every Friday, when he has finished his work for the week, he unlocks his shop door and lets the children come inside to sit near his fire. Mick always has the best fire. The children of Match love to visit Mick, to see his fire, and because he tells them the most wonderful stories. Stories of adventure, stories of places they have never seen. There is one story they all love to hear, and on this cold, snowy Friday in January, they sat down on the floor and once again asked Mick to tell them the story of the dreaded pirate bread loaf Bran. Mick smiled and grabbed his pipe off the shelf, along with a metal matchbox. He sat down in his chair and slowly opened and closed it. It was a beautiful box with a flame engraved on the top. "Mr. Mick?" asked a small boy named Stim. "Why do you have a matchbox? You don't have any matches. No one does. We don't need them." Mick had a funny twinkle in his eye. "Well, my boy," he said softly, "that is a good question. And I have an even better story to go along with it. That is, if anyone would care to hear it." The children squealed with delight and settled in to listen. It got very quiet in the warm workshop. All you could hear was the crackle of the fire. A very long time ago, in a land far away from our land, there was another town. This town was different than Matchstick. It was modernized, as they call it. There was electricity for the lights, for the hot water, and for the heat. The weather there was mild, not cold, like it is here. For many years, no one even needed a fire in that town. That is where we will find the hero of our story. He was a tall, lean fellow with curious eyes, and he was very fast. He lived with his family in a crack in the wall outside of a garage. Our hero's name was Nelly, and he was a matchstick. They say he gave himself his name one day when he was out for a walk. A horse was running down the street, and it almost stepped on Nelly. The man on the horse yelled out, "Whoa, Nelly!" And so our matchstick thought, this should be my name, to remind me to always pay attention. You see, matches are only afraid of two things. Fire is one, and getting broken is another. If that horse had stepped on Nelly, it would have broken him for sure. Nelly wasn't like the other matchsticks. They preferred to stay at home, drinking or soaking in water. Nelly drank his fair share of water, but he didn't like just sitting around and soaking in it. He liked to walk around. He liked to see people and hear their stories. His favorite stories were about the mountains, Nelly really wanted to see some mountains. Well, one day, Nelly heard an older man and a woman in a restaurant talking about their town, somewhere in a land called Montana. Nelly had heard about Montana. They had big mountains there and something called snow. Nelly saw a chance, and he seized it. He followed the man and the woman back to their hotel room, slid under the door when they were asleep, and crawled carefully into one of their suitcases. He was going to have an adventure. He was going to see mountains and not just listen to other people tell stories. He was going to have his own stories. Well, I can tell you he had quite the adventure. It wasn't exactly what he planned on, but he had the time of his life. The couple was retired and wanted to see the world before they went home to Montana. They took Nelly with them, although they never knew he was there. They went to deserts in Africa, and Nelly saw his first elephant on a safari. They went to the Great Wall in China, the Taj Mahal in India, and the skyscrapers in Dubai. They had yerba mate in Argentina, saw a sloth in the rainforests in Costa Rica, and watched the northern lights in Iceland. They went so many places and saw so many things. Nelly saw all these things with them, moving from suitcase to backpack to purse, whatever the occasion called for. One day, this couple came to our land. This was before Matchstick was built. We didn't have a town. There were just a few houses and businesses and the mayor's house. They only planned to stay the night and went to find themselves some food. And that's when it happened. The lady was so tired, she forgot her purse when she left, and Nelly was in her purse. He had fallen asleep, and when he woke up, he was surprised at how quiet it was. He peeked out carefully and looked around to see tables and chairs. There were no lights and there was no heat. Nelly didn't see any people either, so he decided to venture out and see where he was. He stretched for a long time and walked around on the cold floor. He appeared to be in a restaurant, and as it was night, the restaurant was closed. Nelly wasn't worried. The lady would come back for her purse when she discovered it was missing. However, she didn't come back. She didn't come back because she didn't discover it was missing until late the next day, and it was too late to go back for it. So she contacted the hotel, and the hotel manager went down to get her purse so he could mail it to her. You'd think Nelly would have climbed back in the purse just to be on the safe side, but he didn't. He didn't recognize the hotel manager, and before he knew it, the purse was gone, and he was left on his own in a big room that was now filling up with people. So that is how Nelly's travels came to an end in our land. We didn't get many visitors in those days, so there was no way for him to leave, being a small matchstick like he was. I say his travels ended, but not his adventures. For you see, Nelly's story doesn't end here. It wasn't all bad for him in our land, even though he couldn't travel. He met some other matchsticks, made quite a few friends, and told his stories to anyone who would listen to him. He was quite happy to have so many stories of his own to tell others, to share his experiences in other lands, and to see their interested faces looking back at him. Over time, he found that his best audience was the sheep. They would eat, he would talk, and they almost always asked him questions. Then, when everyone was finished, they let Nelly sleep in their wool. He was so comfortable with his life that he didn't notice the other pair of eyes watching him in the darkness each night, or that the days were getting shorter and cooler. One night, from the sheep pen, he noticed a flame dancing through the window of the shepherd's home. "You have fire here?" he asked his friend, Fatty, the sheep. "Of course we have fire," she replied. "How else could we stay warm in the winter?" Nelly got very quiet and suddenly noticed how dark and how cold it was. "I must be on my guard now," he thought. It was a hard winter that year. Wood was in high demand and easy to come by in the mountains, but matches became scarce when a snowstorm blocked supplies from coming in. It was so cold that even the sheep stayed inside with their own fire. When I have finished my story, I will let you decide if this was a good thing or a not so good thing for our hero. Warm and snug in their barn, the sheep were happy to have Nelly distract them from the boredom of being shut up inside all day and all night. When the town started to run out of matches and starting a fire became harder and harder, the sheep were the first to suffer. At first, they didn't mind the cold since Nelly's stories were so good. As winter deepened, however, Nelly started running out of stories from his travels. The sheep started to grumble, for they thought, "What is the point of your stories? It is cold, there is no fire, and we have heard all of your stories before. It would be better if you would make a nice fire to keep us warm." Eventually, Nelly found that he was the only matchstick left in the entire land. One day, one of the sheep brought the shepherd to where Nelly was hiding, and the shepherd saw him. The shepherd tried to grab him, and Nelly had to run to save himself. "It is a good thing I'm fast," he thought, "or I should end up in the fire." It wasn't the last time he would run. All that day he ran constantly. Every man, woman, or child was on the lookout for ways to make a fire. There wasn't a human or an animal in the town that wasn't out to get him. Nelly ran and dodged so much that he forgot to drink water. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, he realized how dry he was. "I must find some water," he thought. He remembered there was a good place where the shepherd watered his sheep, and he headed off in that direction as quickly and quietly as he could. Nelly found the watering hole, but the water had frozen. He found a small patch of sun that had started to melt some of the ice and laid down. He sighed happily as he felt his body soak up the water. With the warm sun on him, he suddenly felt so tired that his eyes closed. And in that second of not being on his guard, he felt 2 fingers close in around his head and yank him out. "Look what I found!" yelled a boy's voice. Nelly could feel the boy start to run, and Nelly started to tremble. Then, all of a sudden, Nelly wasn't in the boy's hand. He was flying through the air. "Zobo, why did you tackle me?" the boy asked angrily. "I just found a matchstick, and now you made me drop it." "I'm sorry, Bart," the boy named Zobo replied. "I heard you yell and thought you were running so we could play." "Well, you were wrong," Bart huffed, looking anxiously at the ground. "Do you see a matchstick?" he asked Zobo. Zobo shook his head as his foot dropped softly over Nelly. Nelly couldn't hear anything as he sank into the mud. He waited anxiously, and after some time, the foot lifted and a hand picked him up very gently. He was staring into the happy green eyes of Zobo. Zobo kept Nelly safe in his pocket all the way home. When he entered the house, Nelly could feel warmth from a fire and could hear a young girl's voice call her brother to the table. Zobo set Nelly down on the table and stared at him over his plate. "Don't worry, you are safe here," Zobo said to Nelly. "I rescued you from Bart so I can hear the end of your story." Nelly's mouth fell open in surprise. "What story? When did you hear my story? I don't understand," he stammered. Zobo laughed. "The story about the sloth, who is the prince of the land called Rainforest," he said. "I have been listening to all your stories every night from the loft in the barn. I love them. That is why I rescued you from Bart. You are far too good a storyteller to be turned into fire." Nelly laughed because he couldn't believe his good fortune. His laugh died as the sister returned to the table and saw him. "Zobo, a matchstick! Give it to me to put it in a safe place. If this fire dies, we will need it to start another fire." Zobo was faster than his sister, and he snatched Nelly before she could. "Imala, no! This matchstick is my friend. He's not for burning. He's a storyteller. Come and listen to the wonderful stories he tells." Imala looked skeptical, but as Zobo was younger than her and she was responsible for him, she decided to humor him and she listened to Nelly. He was a bit nervous, fearing that if his story wasn't good enough for the sister, he would be put aside to light a fire. But when he finished his tale, Imala clapped and asked to hear another one. It was decided that Nelly should live with them and tell them a story every evening while they ate their dinner. They found a safe place for him to sleep, in a metal matchbox with a flame engraved on it, tucked away in a corner. So the three of them lived quite happily into summer. Nelly wanted to travel again, so he would never run out of stories. So he and Zobo spent hours planning new lands and places for them to visit when Zobo was old enough. Before too long, however, the summer nights gave way to cool nights that turned into cold nights once again. Matchsticks became scarce once more, and Imala had a difficult time keeping their fire going at all hours. She and Zobo were very poor, and during the day they both had to work tending sheep to make enough money to survive. They took turns coming home to keep the fire going. One day, while tending sheep, Zobo climbed a rock to rescue one of the sheep, and he slipped and fell. He hit his head so hard that he didn't wake up, and the men from the town carried him back to his home and placed him in his bed. Imala brought Zobo to the doctor, who told her that Zobo needed to be kept very warm and that she should talk to him constantly. Perhaps her voice would wake him up. Imala did her best to keep the fire warm and talked constantly to Zobo during the day, while Nelly talked to him during the night, and yet still he slept. After many days, Imala knew she had to return to tending the sheep, as they were running out of money to buy food and wood. She had to work twice as hard to keep the fire going when she wasn't home, and Nelly talked to Zobo all day and all night. Imala would fall asleep each night listening to Nelly's stories of faraway places, wishing for a warm place with plenty of food. Days passed, and still Zobo slept, and Nelly was getting worried. Imala looked very tired, and his voice was beginning to crack from all the talking. He had also run out of stories, and he was worried Imala would treat him like the sheep did and want to turn him into fire. But Nelly wasn't going to run away from his friends, and one day As he retold the story of the Sloth Prince, he looked up on the table and saw a loaf of bread. No one is quite sure what happened in that moment, but Nelly suddenly began the most wonderful story that night about the dreaded pirate, Breadloaf Bran. You have probably guessed that Nelly's storytelling didn't stop there. He looked everywhere in the room and through the windows, and every time he saw something, from a leaf to a tall oak tree, to a cloud, to a spoon or bowl, the most incredible stories sprang to his mind and out of his mouth. Imala had a hard time sleeping at night, for she wanted very badly to listen to Nelly's stories. Even Zobo showed improvement, for he had taken to moving slightly in his bed, or smiling whenever Nelly told him a new story. One day, however, there was an accident with the sheep, and Imala didn't make it home in time to tend the fire. Nelly was so busy talking about Thunder, the chocolate cloud, who rained chocolate chips down on Istanbul on Christmas Day, that he didn't notice the fire dying slowly behind him, or that Zobo was starting to shiver violently. He had almost finished the story when he looked at Zobo, and then he looked in horror at the fire. Without a thought, he jumped up, ran to the door, and ran down the road to find Imala. It was getting dark, and this saved him from being seen. Since Imala knew his voice, she heard him calling her, and she came running, scooping him up in her hands and headed for their house. As she opened the door, she could feel the cold air and saw Zobo shivering on his bed. The fire had died, and Imala burst into tears. Nelly looked up at her sadly. "It is my fault, for I was so busy telling my stories that I did not notice the fire was dying. Now there is no warmth for you or poor Zobo, and he may die." Imala looked at him through tearful, sad eyes. "It is not your fault, dear friend, for I too did not have time to think of the fire because of my fear for the sheep." Nelly bowed his head and stayed in silence as Imala's tears fell in her hand around him. His own eyes were filled with tears when he looked up at her. "Get as much wood as you can. I shall make a fire for us." Imala sobbed loudly and hugged him closely. "I love my brother, and I have come to love you, and we will find another way. He would never forgive me for taking away the only other one in this world who cares so much for him, the matchstick storyteller who brought so much light to his life. There is no other way. You are not taking me from him, for I am giving myself," Nelly said calmly. "There is nothing for him to forgive. I shall become my own greatest story, and this will not be the end, dear Imala. I will always be in your heart. Every evening, when you eat your supper, you will remember me and my story. You have but to share it with others, and I will live again." Imala stopped crying and wiped her eyes. "We have very little in our lives, and yet we met you, and your stories brought a light and a warmth that is better than any fire. You took us to places we could never hope to go, and helped us see the things in the world in a magical way," she said. "I promise we will not let your fire die, or your light leave our home. May our land be cursed and all who come here die frozen if we fail in our promise." With those words, she kissed Nelly gently. She gathered the wood, and Nelly placed himself back in her hand. "Say a prayer quickly, Imala," Nelly whispered, "for I need courage for myself and hope for Zobo." Imala said a quick prayer, and then, with all the grace she could muster, she gently struck Nelly against the metal tinderbox he slept in. Nelly felt a great warmth rush through him, and he smiled as the flames danced on the wood. "Farewell, and remember me, my dear friends," he called to Zobo and Amala. As he burst into flames, a tear from Amala's cheek fell into him, and he turned to ash. As the ashes met the fire, there was a blue flash, a soft sigh, and the room immediately filled with warmth. Zobo stopped shivering and sat up in his bed. He saw Amala's face, and he saw the fire, and he knew. She hugged him while they both cried. That evening, as they ate their small meal in silence, from the flames of the fire, they could hear Nelly softly telling them his stories even still. Amala and Zobo did not fail to honor their promise to Nelly. They tended their fire faithfully, though it seemed to have some magic in it to help them, for it did not burn nor need tending like any other fire. At night they would listen to Nelly's stories coming from the flames, and tell his greatest story to anyone who would listen. In time, word spread, and people from all over the land and other lands came to hear the story. If they should, by chance, take some of the fire to warm their home, they found the fire would burn all winter. In time, Amala and Zobo grew old and passed the magic flame to their children, and so it continued for many years. The town of Matchstick was built around their home, and their home has always been the heart of our town. We must always take care to tend our heart's fire, lest our land fall under Amala's curse. We must always listen to his greatest story and tell it to others. The children were very quiet when Mick finished the story. "Mr. Mick?" asked a small girl. When Mick looked at her, she pointed to his fire, dancing merrily in the darkness. "Is that Nelly's fire?" Mick smiled and nodded. "It is. Now you all know why we don't have a single matchstick in Matchstick. If we faithfully tend our fire, it will never go out."